Tonight, let me take you on a journey to 15th century Paris, where cobblestone streets echo with the sound of horse hooves and cathedral bells ring out across a city painted in twilight hues. This isn't just any bedtime story. This is a tale of two hearts finding each other against impossible odds, where courage blooms like wildflowers between the cracks of ancient stone walls. Close your eyes and let yourself drift back to a time when love letters were written by candlelight and promises were whispered beneath star-filled skies. Tonight, we follow Esmeralda, the spirited dancer whose emerald eyes held secrets deeper than the Seine, and Captain Phoebus, the golden-haired soldier whose armor couldn't protect him from the one wound that would change everything. His heart, in the shadow of Notre Dame Cathedral, where gargoyles kept silent watch over the sleeping city. Their story begins not with grand declarations or royal proclamations, but with a single glance that lasted no longer than a heartbeat, yet echoed through eternity. Sometimes the most powerful moments arrive disguised as ordinary ones. A smile shared across a crowded marketplace, a hand extended in kindness, a choice to see beauty where others see only difference. So settle into your pillows, let your breathing slow, and allow me to paint for you a world where love conquers fear, where understanding bridges the widest chasms, and where two souls discover that home isn't a place marked on any map. It's found in the eyes of someone who sees you exactly as you are and loves you, not despite your imperfections, but because of them. The morning sun cast long, golden shadows across the Place de Grève as Esmeralda adjusted the tiny bells sewn into her colorful skirt. Market day always brought crowds to the square, and crowds meant coins tossed into her tambourine after her performances. She had learned long ago that survival in Paris required more than just hope. It demanded skill, timing, and the ability to read faces in a crowd like ancient manuscripts. Her fingers traced the worn leather of her tambourine as she surveyed the gathering merchants and early shoppers. Somewhere, in the distance, the cathedral bells chimed 7 times, their bronze voices carrying across the city like a gentle reminder that each new day held infinite possibilities. Today felt different somehow. The air itself seemed to shimmer with anticipation, though she couldn't quite name what she was anticipating. Jolly, her beloved goat companion, nuzzled against her leg as if sensing her unusual mood. She scratched behind his ears and whispered, "What do you think, my friend? Shall we show them something they've never seen before?" The goat's amber eyes sparkled with what she could have sworn was understanding. Together, they had weathered countless storms, both literal and metaphorical. He was more than a pet. He was family, confidant, and the one constant in a life that had taught her to expect change as surely as sunrise. As the square filled with the familiar symphony of morning commerce, vendors calling their wares, children laughing, wheels creaking against cobblestone, Esmeralda began her ritual. She closed her eyes and let the music inside her heart guide her movements. Dancing wasn't something she did. It was something she was. The rhythm lived in her bones, flowed through her veins like lifeblood itself. Her first dance began slowly, a gentle swaying that gradually built into something more elaborate. The bells on her clothing created their own melody, harmonizing with the deeper percussion of her tambourine. One by one, heads turned in her direction. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Even the vendors momentarily forgot their haggling to watch this young woman transform the ordinary morning into something magical. What none of them realized including Esmeralda herself, was that from a window high above the square, another pair of eyes had found her. Captain Phoebus de Martin stood at his post, supposedly keeping watch over the marketplace for signs of trouble. Instead, he found himself captivated by the graceful figure spinning in the sunlight below. He had seen countless street performers during his years stationed in Paris: jugglers, musicians, acrobats, storytellers. They came and went like seasons, each trying to earn their daily bread through entertainment. But this was different. This wasn't mere performance. This was poetry, written in motion, a language that spoke directly to something deep within his chest that he had forgotten existed. The captain's hands gripped the stone windowsill as he watched her dance. Her movements told stories without words, painted emotions in the air, with gestures so fluid they seemed to defy the very laws that bound earthbound mortals. When she spun, her dark hair caught the light like spun silk. When she leapt, she seemed to float for just a moment longer than physics should have allowed. Phoebus had built his reputation on being practical, logical, unswayed by flights of fancy. He was a soldier, trained to see threats and opportunities, to make decisions based on facts rather than feelings. Yet here he stood, feeling as though the world had suddenly shifted on its axis, leaving him grasping for balance in a reality that no longer made complete sense. Below in the square, Esmeralda's dance reached its crescendo. She leaped higher, spun faster, the bells creating a symphony that seemed to call to every heart in the crowd. When she finally came to rest, arms extended toward the morning sky like a bird taking flight, the silence that followed was profound. For a moment, the entire marketplace held its breath. Then the applause erupted. Coins clinked into her tambourine as people pressed forward, eager to show their appreciation for what they had just witnessed. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, begging to see the pretty lady dance again. Even the gruffest merchants found themselves smiling, touched by a joy they couldn't quite explain, but didn't want to question. From his window above, Phoebus watched the crowd's reaction with a mixture of pride and something else, something that felt almost like protectiveness. He found himself scanning the faces below, looking for anyone who might pose a threat to the remarkable young woman who had just turned an ordinary morning into an extraordinary memory. That's when he noticed them. 3 figures standing at the edge of the crowd, their dark robes marking them as clergy. But these weren't the kindly parish priests who blessed bread and comforted the grieving. These men watched Esmeralda with expressions that made Phoebus's soldier instincts sharpen to razor focus. The tallest of the 3, a gaunt man whose face seemed carved from winter itself, spoke in hushed tones to his companions. Even from this distance, Phoebus could read the disapproval in their posture, the way they pointed and whispered as if witnessing something scandalous rather than beautiful. Esmeralda, still catching her breath from her performance, seemed oblivious to their scrutiny. She was busy thanking the crowd, accepting their coins with gracious nods and warm smiles that lit up her entire face. Jolly performed small tricks beside her, walking on his hind legs and shaking hands with delighted children. But Phoebus saw what she didn't. He saw how the 3 men in robes exchanged meaningful glances. He saw one of them make a subtle gesture toward a group of guards stationed near the cathedral steps. He saw the net of suspicion and prejudice beginning to close around an innocent young woman whose only crime was bringing beauty into a world that desperately needed it. Without conscious thought, Phoebus found himself moving away from the window, his hand automatically checking that his sword hung properly at his side. He had sworn an oath to protect the people of Paris, and that oath didn't distinguish between nobleman and street performer, between those who worshipped in cathedrals and those who found their church beneath the open sky. As he made his way down the stone steps of his tower, Phoebus tried to convince himself that this was merely duty calling, a captain of the guard responding to a potential disturbance. Nothing more complicated than that. But his heart, traitorous organ that it was, beat with a rhythm that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the graceful figure who had just taught him that morning light could dance. In the square below, Esmeralda gathered her few belongings, unaware that her life was about to change forever. She tucked the coins into a small pouch at her waist, enough for bread and perhaps a bit of cheese to share with Jolly. Simple needs, simply met. She had learned not to dream beyond the next meal, the next safe place to sleep. Dreams, she had discovered, were luxuries that people like her couldn't afford. But today, something felt different. As she prepared to move on to the next potential venue for her performances, she found herself glancing up at the buildings surrounding the square. For just a moment, she could have sworn she felt eyes upon her. Not the casual observation of passers-by, but something more intense, more personal. She shook her head, dismissing the feeling as imagination. Street performers learned to be aware of their surroundings, but sometimes that awareness could border on paranoia. Still, as she gathered Jolly's lead and prepared to leave the Place de Grève, she couldn't shake the sensation that this morning's dance had set something in motion. Something that would ripple outward like stones thrown into still water, creating waves that would eventually reach shores she couldn't yet imagine. The cathedral bells chimed the half hour, their bronze voices carrying across the awakening city like a benediction. In their ancient song, Esmeralda heard something she had never heard before, a promise, perhaps, or maybe just an invitation to believe that even in a world that often seemed cold and unforgiving, magic still existed for those brave enough to dance with it. With it, the heavy wooden door of the guard tower swung open with a creak that seemed to announce Phoebus's arrival to the entire square. He stepped into the morning sunlight, his golden hair catching the rays like spun metal, his captain's uniform marking him as someone of importance among the common folk who filled the marketplace. Yet for all his authority, for all the deference shown by merchants who stepped aside to let him pass, he felt strangely uncertain as he made his way toward the center of the square. Esmeralda was securing her tambourine to her belt when she noticed the ripple of attention moving through the crowd. People were turning, bowing slightly, creating a pathway for someone approaching. She followed their gazes and found herself looking at a man who seemed to have stepped from the pages of a courtly romance. Tall and broad-shouldered, with kind eyes that held both strength and something softer, something that made her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with her recent performance. Their eyes met across the distance of perhaps 20 paces, and the world seemed to pause. The merchants' calls faded to whispers. The children's laughter became distant music. Even Jolly stopped his playful antics and sat perfectly still, as if recognizing that something profound was happening to his beloved companion. Phoebus had imagined this moment during his descent from the tower. He would approach professionally, perhaps commend her performance, ensure she understood the local regulations for street entertainment. Simple, straightforward, the kind of interaction he handled dozens of times each week. But now, standing in the actual presence of the woman who had made sunlight dance, he found every carefully planned word dissolving like morning mist. She was even more beautiful up close. But it wasn't her beauty that stopped his breath. It was the intelligence that sparkled in her emerald eyes. The way she held herself with quiet dignity, despite her humble circumstances. There was strength in the set of her shoulders, kindness in the gentle way she calmed Jolly with a touch, and something indefinable that made him feel as though he were seeing color for the first time after a lifetime of shadows. "Good morning," he managed, his voice rougher than intended. "I am Captain Phoebus de Martin. I couldn't help but notice your performance from my post above." Esmeralda felt heat rise in her cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or something else entirely, she couldn't say. Men in positions of authority rarely approached her with anything resembling kindness. Usually, they came with warnings, accusations, or worse. But this captain's tone held none of those familiar threats. If anything, he seemed almost nervous, which struck her as endearingly incongruous, given his obvious rank and bearing. "I hope I haven't violated any ordinances, Captain," she replied, her voice carrying the musical quality that made even simple words sound like poetry. "I always try to be respectful of the merchants and their customers." "No, no," Phoebus said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "You've done nothing wrong. Quite the opposite, actually. Your dancing brought joy to everyone here. I've been watching this square for 3 years, and I've never seen people smile the way they did just now." The honesty in his voice surprised them both. Phoebus wasn't given to flowery speeches or unnecessary compliments. He dealt in facts, in practical observations. Yet here he stood, speaking truths that felt dangerous in their vulnerability. Esmeralda studied his face, searching for the deception she had learned to expect from those who wielded power over people like her. Instead, she found only sincerity and something that looked remarkably like wonder. When was the last time anyone had looked at her that way? Not as a curiosity or a threat or an object to be used, but as a person worthy of genuine admiration. "You're very kind to say so," she murmured, her fingers absently stroking Jolly's head. The goat seemed to approve of this golden-haired stranger, which was unusual. Jolly had excellent instincts about people, and his acceptance carried more weight with Esmeralda than any number of pretty words. The conversation might have continued in this tentative, sweetly awkward manner, but the 3 robed figures Phoebus had noticed earlier chose that moment to make their presence known. They approached with the purposeful stride of men accustomed to having their authority acknowledged without question. "Captain de Martin," the tallest of them called out, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "We require a word with you regarding this entertainment." The way he spoke the last word made it sound like something distasteful, something that left a bitter taste on the tongue. Esmeralda felt the familiar chill of recognition. She had encountered men like these before, men who saw sin in laughter and corruption in beauty, men who believed that joy itself was somehow an affront to their version of righteousness. Phoebus turned to face the approaching clerics, his expression shifting subtly from the warmth he had shown Esmeralda to the cooler professionalism he reserved for difficult situations. "Father Olivier," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "How may I assist you?" "This woman," Father Olivier said, gesturing toward Esmeralda without actually looking at her, "has been performing what can only be described as pagan rituals in full view of decent Christian folk. Such displays are not only inappropriate, but potentially dangerous to the moral fabric of our community." Esmeralda felt the words like physical blows. Pagan rituals, as if her dancing, the expression of joy that flowed as naturally from her as breathing, was somehow evil. She had heard such accusations before, but they never stopped hurting, never stopped making her feel like something shameful and wrong. "I saw a young woman sharing her talent with an appreciative audience," Phoebus replied, his voice carefully controlled, but with an edge that hadn't been there moments before. "Nothing more, nothing less. Captain, surely you understand the importance of maintaining proper order," Father Olivier pressed. "These traveling performers often bring with them customs and beliefs that are contrary to our Christian values. We simply cannot allow such influences to take root in Paris." The other two clerics nodded their agreement, their expressions reflecting the same mixture of disapproval and self-righteousness that Esmeralda had learned to recognize as the face of those who found purpose in other people's suffering. Phoebus glanced at Esmeralda, seeing how she had drawn into herself, how her shoulders had curved inward, as if trying to make herself smaller, less visible. The transformation from the confident, radiant performer of moments before to this guarded, wounded young woman made something angry stir in his chest. "Father Olivier," he said, his voice taking on the tone of absolute authority that came with his rank, "I have been tasked with maintaining peace and order in this district. I see no disturbance here, no threat to public safety or morality. The young lady has conducted herself with perfect propriety." The priest's eyes narrowed. "Captain, I fear your judgment may be compromised by worldly considerations. Perhaps it would be better if we discussed this matter with your superior." It was a threat, thinly veiled but unmistakable. Phoebus felt the familiar weight of political pressure, the delicate balance between duty to his position and duty to his conscience. He had navigated such waters before, but never when the stakes felt quite so personal. Before he could respond, Esmeralda stepped forward slightly, her chin lifting with a pride that refused to be diminished by cruel words. "Fathers," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor he could see in her hands, "I meant no disrespect to your faith or your community. I simply shared what gifts I have been given. If my presence causes distress, I will move on." The grace with which she offered to sacrifice her own comfort for the sake of peace struck Phoebus like a revelation. Here was someone who understood true strength, true nobility, not the inherited kind that came with titles and lands, but the earned kind that came from choosing kindness even when kindness wasn't returned. "That won't be necessary," he said firmly, his decision crystallizing like ice, forming on still water. "Miss Esmeralda," she supplied quietly. "Miss Esmeralda has every right to perform in the public squares of Paris, provided she follows the same guidelines as any other entertainer, guidelines which she has clearly observed." He turned back to the priests, his stance broadening slightly, subtly placing himself between them and the young woman they sought to intimidate. Father Olivier's face darkened, but he was too politically astute to push the confrontation further in such a public setting. "Very well, Captain, but be assured, this matter is far from concluded. There are those in positions of authority who share our concerns about the moral climate of this city." With that thinly veiled threat hanging in the morning air, the three clerics withdrew, their black robes swirling around them like storm clouds seeking another place to reign. The crowd, which had been watching the exchange with the fascinated attention usually reserved for street theater, began to disperse as the entertainment apparently concluded. Esmeralda and Phoebus found themselves alone in the suddenly quiet square, the weight of what had just transpired settling between them like a bridge neither was quite sure how to cross. "Thank you," she said finally, the words carrying depths of meaning that a simple expression of gratitude couldn't fully convey. "You did nothing wrong," he replied, and the conviction in his voice made her believe, perhaps for the first time in her life, that someone truly saw her as she was, rather than as what others expected her to be. The silence that followed felt both fragile and precious, like the moment between lightning and thunder, when the world holds its breath. Esmeralda found herself studying this captain, who had chosen to stand between her and those who would judge her harshly. There was something in his bearing that spoke of battles fought not just on fields of war, but in the quieter conflicts of conscience that define a person's character. Phoebus cleared his throat softly, suddenly aware that they were standing in the middle of the square, like actors who had forgotten their lines. "Perhaps," he ventured, "you might allow me to escort you to a safer part of the city. Those men may return with reinforcements, and I would hate for your morning to be further disrupted." Esmeralda tilted her head, considering this unexpected offer. In her experience, men in positions of power rarely made gestures without expecting something in return. Yet there was nothing in his manner that suggested ulterior motives. If anything, he seemed almost shy. This golden-haired captain, who commanded respect from every corner of Paris, yet appeared nervous in the presence of one wandering performer. "That's very kind of you, Captain, but I wouldn't want to impose on your duties," she replied, though something in her voice suggested she wasn't entirely opposed to the idea. Jolly, ever the judge of character, had wandered over to investigate Phoebus more thoroughly, sniffing at his boots with the serious concentration of a scholar examining ancient texts. "Actually," Phoebus said, watching with amusement as the goat apparently decided he passed inspection, "ensuring the safety of Paris citizens is precisely my duty. Besides, I know these streets better than most, and there are places where performers are not only welcome, but genuinely appreciated." There was truth in his words, but they both knew this wasn't entirely about duty or safety. Something had shifted in the fabric of the ordinary world, creating a space where a captain of the guard and a street dancer could find themselves drawn together by forces neither fully understood. As they began walking, Phoebus found himself acutely aware of everything about her presence beside him: the way the morning light caught in her dark hair, the gentle sound of the small bells sewn into her clothing, the graceful way she moved even in simple walking. He had spent years training himself to notice details that might indicate threats or opportunities, but this was different. This was noticing for the pure pleasure of observation, like studying a work of art or listening to music that stirred something deep within the soul. Esmeralda, for her part, was discovering that conversation with this unexpected protector came surprisingly easily. When she mentioned that she and Jolly had only recently arrived in Paris, he told her about the best markets for fresh bread and which fountain provided the cleanest water. When she spoke of her love for the ancient stories that influenced her dances, he shared tales of the city's history, bringing the stones around them to life with accounts of the people who had walked these same paths centuries before. They paused at a small chapel tucked between larger buildings, its modest bell tower reaching toward the sky like a prayer made manifest. The bronze bell hanging there was smaller than those at Notre Dame, but its voice carried a sweeter tone, less commanding, but somehow more intimate. "I've always loved the sound of bells," Esmeralda said softly, gazing up at the tower. They speak a language that doesn't need words. Joy, sorrow, celebration, warning, everything the human heart feels, bells can express. Phoebus followed her gaze, seeing the familiar structure through her eyes and finding it transformed. "I never thought of it that way," he admitted. "To me, they were always just signals. Time to change the guard, call to prayer, alarm, if needed. But you're right, they do carry emotion." As if summoned by their conversation, the chapel bell began to chime the hour. 9 clear notes rang across the morning air, each one seeming to hover for a moment before giving way to the next. In the silence that followed, both of them felt the weight of time passing, the sense that this morning was already becoming memory, something precious to be preserved against future darkness. They continued their walk through neighborhoods where laundry hung like colorful flags from upper windows, and children played games that required nothing more than imagination and cobblestones. Here, away from the scrutiny of the more formal districts, Esmeralda seemed to relax, her natural warmth emerging like sunshine after clouds. She told him about her travels, the villages and towns where she had performed, each with its own character and customs. Some places had welcomed her with open arms, others with suspicion, but all had taught her something about the infinite variety of human nature. Her stories painted pictures of a world beyond Paris, a broader tapestry of life that fascinated Phoebus, whose duties had kept him largely confined to the city's boundaries. In return, he shared his own observations about Paris and its people, the way the bakers began their work before dawn so that fresh bread would greet the rising sun, how the flower vendors at the cathedral steps knew the stories behind every bouquet they sold, the secret kindnesses that passed between neighbors when they thought no one was watching. As they talked, they found themselves naturally synchronizing their pace, their steps falling into harmony, like dancers who had rehearsed together for years. Jolly trotted alongside them, occasionally stopping to investigate interesting scents or to accept attention from children who delighted in his friendly nature. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the city in shades of gold and amber that made even the most ordinary corners seem touched with magic. Market vendors called their wares in voices that had become part of the city's heartbeat, while the scent of baking bread and blooming flowers created an atmosphere of simple, enduring hope. They found themselves in the Garden District, where wealthy merchants and minor nobles maintained small but exquisite outdoor spaces. Through ornate iron gates, glimpses of carefully tended roses and manicured lawns offered reminders that beauty could be cultivated as well as discovered. Yet neither of them felt the gardens were more lovely than the wild flowers that grew in abandoned lots, where nature painted according to its own mysterious design. It was here, beneath an ancient oak tree whose branches had witnessed centuries of human joy and sorrow, that their conversation turned more personal. Esmeralda spoke of her dreams, modest though they were, a place to call home, even temporarily, the chance to share her art without fear. Perhaps someday, a small dance academy where she could teach children that movement was another form of prayer, another way of celebrating the gift of being alive. Phoebus listened with an attention that went beyond mere politeness. In her words, he heard echoes of his own deepest longings, the desire to serve something greater than himself, to use his position and abilities to create rather than merely maintain. He had become a soldier to protect people, but somewhere along the way, the daily routines had obscured that original purpose. Listening to her reminded him of why he had chosen this path in the first place. When she asked about his own aspirations, he found himself speaking more honestly than he had in years about his hope to someday earn a position where he could implement real reforms, making the city safer and more just for everyone who called it home, about his belief that strength should be used to protect the vulnerable rather than simply to enforce the will of the powerful. Their conversation was interrupted by the appearance of a young boy, perhaps 8 years old, who approached with the mixture of boldness and shyness that marked children at that age. He had been following them for several blocks, clearly fascinated by Jolly, but uncertain how to make contact. Esmeralda noticed him first, her performer's instincts attuned to audience even when she wasn't actively entertaining. "Hello there," she said gently, crouching down to bring herself to the child's eye level. "Would you like to meet my friend, Jolly?" The boy nodded eagerly, and soon he was giggling with delight as the goat performed small tricks for his amusement. Phoebus watched the interaction with growing admiration for Esmeralda's natural way with children, the genuine care she showed for this little stranger who had wandered into their morning. When the boy's mother appeared, clearly having been searching for her wandering son, she approached with the wariness that common folk usually showed toward authority figures. But Esmeralda's presence seemed to reassure her, and soon she too was smiling at Jolly's antics. "Thank you for being so kind to him," the woman said to Esmeralda. "He's been talking about seeing a dancing lady with a goat, but I thought it was just one of his stories. Children often see the magic that adults forget to notice," Esmeralda replied, straightening as the boy reluctantly prepared to leave with his mother. Never let him lose that gift. As they watched the mother and child disappear around a corner, Phoebus felt something shift inside his chest. The simple interaction had revealed yet another facet of this remarkable woman who seemed to carry light wherever she went. She didn't just perform for audiences. She created moments of wonder for anyone fortunate enough to cross her path. The cathedral bells of Notre Dame began to ring in the distance, their deep voices carrying news of the approaching noon hour. The morning that had begun with a dance in the marketplace had transformed into something neither of them could have anticipated when they first saw each other across that crowded square. The bells seemed to mark not just the passage of time, but the deepening of something fragile and precious growing between them. As their echoes faded into the warm air, Phoebus realized he had been walking through Paris for hours without once thinking about his duties, his reports, or the political complexities that usually occupied his mind. Instead, he had been completely present in each moment, each conversation, each shared smile. "I should probably let you return to your performances," he said reluctantly, though everything in his voice suggested he would rather do anything else. "I don't want to keep you from earning your day's bread." Esmeralda looked up at him with those emerald eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding beyond her years. "Actually," she said softly, "this has been the most peaceful morning I've had since arriving in Paris. Usually, I'm constantly watching for trouble, planning my next move, wondering if I'll find a safe place to sleep. Walking with you, I almost forgot to worry." Her honesty touched something in Phoebus that he hadn't realized was wounded. The idea that his presence could provide comfort rather than intimidation, that his authority could be a shield, protecting, rather than a sword, threatening, awakened a part of his identity he had thought lost to the harsh realities of military life. "Would you?" he began, then stopped, suddenly uncertain. He was a captain in the Royal Guard. She was a traveling performer with no fixed address and no social standing. The gulf between their worlds should have been insurmountable. Yet here, in the golden light of this perfect morning, those differences seemed as insubstantial as shadows. "Would I what?" she prompted gently, and he could have sworn there was hope hidden in her question. "Would you allow me to show you more of the city? Perhaps this afternoon, when my duties are complete? I know places where the sunset paints the Seine like molten copper, where the old stones tell stories that would inspire a dozen new dances." Esmeralda's smile bloomed slowly, like a flower opening to sunlight. "I would like that very much, Captain." "Phoebus," he corrected. "Just Phoebus, when we're not in the formal squares, with priests watching our every word." "Phoebus," she repeated, and somehow his name sounded different in her voice, more musical, more meaningful. "It means sun, doesn't it, in the old language?" He nodded, surprised that she knew the etymology. "My mother was fond of classical stories. She said she chose the name because I was born during the brightest sunrise she had ever seen." "It suits you," Esmeralda said simply, but the way she looked at him suggested she saw the truth in the naming. There was indeed something solar about him, something that brought warmth and light to spaces that had grown too familiar with shadow. They arranged to meet at the fountain near the cathedral steps when the afternoon bells chimed 4 times. As they parted ways, each heading toward their respective responsibilities, both carried with them the glow of anticipation. The morning had been unexpected. The afternoon held promise of something even more precious. Phoebus returned to his duties with a lightness in his step that his fellow guards noticed immediately. Captain de Martin, usually so serious and focused, actually hummed while reviewing the duty rosters. When asked about his unusually cheerful mood, he simply smiled and deflected with observations about the beautiful weather. But beneath his improved spirits ran an undercurrent of concern. Father Olivier's threats had not been idle posturing. The priest wielded considerable influence in certain circles, and Phoebus knew that his defense of Esmeralda would not be forgotten or forgiven. There would be consequences, subtle at first perhaps, but growing more serious if he continued to protect someone the church hierarchy had marked as problematic. The thought should have given him pause, should have made him reconsider the wisdom of becoming further involved with a woman who attracted such dangerous attention. Instead, it only strengthened his resolve. If protecting innocence and beauty meant facing political pressure, then so be it. Some things were worth the risk. Meanwhile, Esmeralda made her way to the river district, where the afternoon crowds would be larger and more diverse. But for the first time in memory, her heart wasn't fully focused on her performance. Part of her remained in that morning conversation, replaying moments and words, marveling at how natural it had felt to walk beside someone who saw her as simply human rather than exotic or threatening. She had learned to be cautious with her trust, especially when it came to men in positions of power. Too many times, kindness had proven to be a mask for less noble intentions. Yet something about Phoebus felt different. Perhaps it was the way he had positioned himself between her and the hostile priests, not with dramatic gestures, but with quiet, unshakable conviction. Or perhaps it was how he had listened to her stories, without trying to change or judge them. Her afternoon performance near the docks drew an enthusiastic crowd, sailors and merchants who appreciated her skill and showed their approval with generous coins. But even as she danced, part of her mind was already moving toward 4 o'clock, toward the fountain, toward the continuation of whatever this morning had begun. As the sun reached its zenith and began its slow descent toward the western horizon. Both Esmeralda and Phoebus found themselves counting the hours until their reunion. Neither fully understood what was happening between them, but both recognized it as something rare and precious in a world that often seemed designed to crush such delicate flowers before they could fully bloom. The afternoon light slanted through the narrow streets of Paris, painting everything in hues of amber and rose. In taverns and workshops, in noble halls and humble cottages, the city's inhabitants went about their daily routines, unaware that somewhere among them, two hearts were discovering that love could indeed bloom in the most unlikely soil. The cathedral bells began their 4 o'clock song, bronze voices calling across the city with news that another day was turning toward evening. Near the fountain where they had agreed to meet, a captain of the guard and a dancing girl both hurried through the streets, each carrying the same bright anticipation, each hoping that the magic of the morning had been real and lasting. When Esmeralda arrived at the fountain, slightly breathless from her quick walk across the city, she found Phoebus already waiting. He had changed from his formal uniform into simpler clothes, though he still carried his sword out of habit and regulation. The sight of him in civilian dress, leaning casually against the stone edge of the fountain, made him seem somehow more approachable, more real. "I was afraid you might not come," he admitted as she approached, and the vulnerability in his voice made her heart skip. "I was afraid you might reconsider," she replied, and they shared a smile that acknowledged the mutual uncertainty and mutual hope that had brought them both to this moment. "Shall we?" he asked, offering his arm in a gesture that managed to be both courtly and completely natural. As they walked away from the fountain together, the afternoon sun painting long shadows on the cobblestones ahead of them, neither could have imagined how this simple decision to spend more time together would echo through their lives and the life of the city itself. Love, they were about to discover, had its own geography, its own laws, its own irresistible gravity. The ancient stones of Paris had witnessed countless love stories over the centuries, but as Esmeralda and Phoebus disappeared into the golden maze of streets and possibilities, even the gargoyles seemed to lean forward with interest, as if recognizing that this particular tale might be one worth remembering. The afternoon light transformed Paris into a living painting, as Phoebus guided Esmeralda through winding paths she had never seen before. These weren't the main thoroughfares where merchants hawked their wares, or the grand boulevards where nobility paraded in silk and velvet. These were the secret arteries of the city, narrow lanes where ivy climbed ancient walls and forgotten gardens bloomed behind wrought iron gates. "This is the old quarter," Phoebus explained, as they passed beneath an archway carved with symbols that predated the cathedral by centuries. Most people rush past it on their way to somewhere more important, but I've always thought it held the city's true heart. Esmeralda ran her fingers along the weathered stone, feeling the countless hands that had touched these same surfaces over generations. "It feels different here," she murmured, "quieter, but not empty, like the stones themselves are holding conversations we can't quite hear." Her observation delighted him. Most people saw only old buildings and narrow spaces, obstacles to navigate, rather than stories to discover. But she understood something deeper, something that connected the present moment to all the moments that had come before. They emerged into a small courtyard where a single elm tree spread its branches like a green cathedral vault. Beneath its shade, an elderly woman sat feeding breadcrumbs to a collection of sparrows that seemed to know her as an old friend. She looked up as they approached, her weathered face creasing into a smile of recognition. "Captain Phoebus," she called out in a voice like rustling leaves. "It's been too long since you visited my little kingdom." "Madame Celeste," he replied with genuine warmth, bowing slightly. "May I present my friend Esmeralda? She's new to our city and has a gift for seeing beauty that others overlook." The old woman studied Esmeralda with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of decades. "Ah, yes, the dancer from the marketplace. Word travels quickly in these old streets, child. They say you made the very air sparkle with your movements." Esmeralda flushed, unused to such kind attention from strangers. "You're very gracious, madame." "Gracious nothing," Celeste chuckled, scattering another handful of crumbs that sent the sparrows into a flurry of grateful chirping. "I may be too old to see your dances, but I can read faces well enough. You have the look of someone who knows that joy is meant to be shared, not hoarded." Jolly, ever curious, had wandered over to investigate the bird congregation. The sparrows, rather than fleeing, seemed to regard him as just another unusual but harmless visitor to their daily feast. One particularly bold bird even perched briefly on his back, causing Madame Celeste to laugh with pure delight. "Even the creatures recognize a gentle soul," she observed. "Animals and children always know truth faster than the rest of us. They haven't learned to doubt their first impressions." As they continued their exploration, leaving the courtyard with the old woman's blessings, Esmeralda found herself marveling at how easily Phoebus moved between different worlds. With his fellow guards, he commanded respect through authority and competence. With Madame Celeste, he showed the affection of a grandson visiting beloved family. Each interaction revealed another facet of his character, like turning a prism to catch different angles of light. They climbed a series of worn stone steps that wound upward between buildings so old their upper stories nearly touched, creating a tunnel of shadow and whispered history. The ascent was steep enough to leave them both slightly breathless, but when they finally reached the top, the view that greeted them was worth every step. Paris spread below them like a map drawn by angels. The Seine curved through the city like a silver ribbon, catching fragments of sunlight and scattering them like diamonds across its surface. Notre Dame rose majestically in the distance, its twin towers reaching toward heaven with the confidence of faith made manifest in stone. From this height, the bustle and noise of street level faded to a gentle murmur, the city's heartbeat rather than its urgent demands. "I come here when I need to remember why I love this place," Phoebus said softly, standing close enough to her that she could feel the warmth radiating from his shoulder. From down there, in the middle of all the politics and problems, it's easy to forget that we're part of something magnificent. And so, beneath the watchful stars that have witnessed countless love stories bloom and fade across the centuries, Esmeralda and Phoebus discovered what poets have always known, but seldom dared to whisper. That love arrives not with fanfare or grand proclamations, but in quiet moments of recognition, in the gentle meeting of two souls who suddenly understand they were meant to find each other in this vast, beautiful, complicated world. Sweet dreams, dear listener. May your own heart remember that magic still dances in the spaces between heartbeats, waiting patiently for those brave enough to believe.